the so it's very interesting that you conducted some funerals, Ian, because I've done two as well. And I'm not, as a celebrant, I'm not ordained or anything like that, but just friends who asked me if they would preside over the celebration of their lives of their loved ones. It's a real privilege.
It is a real privilege, yes, absolutely. And it's a privilege to be asked before the event.
Well, yeah, yes. Yeah, in my case, it was the families who asked me. But yeah.
When you said you'd got two booked, Ian, I thought you meant sort of in the next week or two that people had asked you, but what you mean is they're sort of provisionals.
Yes, they're friends of my parents, and one is 95 and one's 91, and I've told them that I won't be available for a number of years.
We started off talking about our neighbour here who's 95, just next to us in France. And whenever somebody dies in the commune, the mayor puts up on the notice board in each sort of group of houses that someone's died, where they were from, and how old they were. And the ages are routinely in the 80s, mostly in the 90s, and sometimes in the hundreds. So we're optimistic. We've got an optimistic outlook for the rest of the life out here. It is interesting. And then, of course, you suddenly hear of people who are your own age who've died very suddenly. And that sort of brings it a bit closer to home.
Is that practice of giving the names and ages and things, is that common in France, or is it your particular mayor who does?
No, I think it's probably a legal thing. It's one of those French laws, I think, because it's routine. You see it everywhere.
We used to have the same. I'm sure it's still the same in Italy. There are like notes with the name, age, and relatives that announce the death of the person. So we have the same, yeah.
The premise here is it gives when the funeral will be and where, and the premise is that the community is then able to get to it, because in France people have to be buried within a week. A very rapid process.
Yeah.
And so it's a way of making sure everyone knows that they can get to that. And that's one. I mean, that is one of the good things about the French system, is there's a local kind of communications network through the mayor's office, which is quite handy.
Good.
It sounds like a very good system, but in Scotland, it's habitually 3 weeks now between time of death and the funeral, and sometimes a lot longer. My cousin is a minister of the Church of Scotland, and he was quoted 6 weeks for his mother's funeral. And then he said, "Oh, well, thank you very much. It's the Reverend Dr. So-and-so here." And they said, "Oh, wait a minute. Let's just check the diary in case."
Wow.
So that's Edinburgh, 6 weeks. Long before COVID, it can happen. That was Christmas, of course.
Well, in Italy, it's a little bit like France, so maximum 3 days, basically. Yeah. 3 days, yeah, that's the maximum time that, but I'm talking about a village where I come from, so it's, there are many people, but I imagine that bigger cities, probably they have almost the same problem like the UK. I'm not sure about that, but certainly in little villages, it's maximum 3 days.
There is a correlation between historical customs and the climate, warmer climates.
Yeah, sure, yeah, absolutely.
But normally in Scotland, even when I was young, 3 days would have been normal. Now it's I think people just, if they had to travel, couldn't get there. And nowadays they hold the funeral until people have traveled from all around the world to get there.
I mean, something I've observed through the funerals I've been to or had anything to do with is that British culture, or English culture, but probably British, is very much to not demonstrate sadness or grief in public if we can help it. I mean, everyone expects it, but we all try to contain it. And I don't know why that is, because having been lucky enough to travel into quite a number of other cultures where sort of grief of death of a loved one is very demonstrative, with you know, wailing and shouting, maybe dancing, all sorts of different kinds of ways of expressing very, very actively that you are sorry this person you loved is gone, which seems much more appropriate than biting your upper lip and trying not to cry. And I don't know why that is, but it's a shame, it seems to me, because we even say they were very strong, don't we, as if it's a good thing that they didn't break down in public.
Yes, and if people are giving a eulogy, or, you know, speaking at a funeral in some way, shape or form, there's the feeling often that they themselves have failed themselves if they do show emotion, and that is so unrealistic, as you're saying, really. But there's always I mean, I've been to a number of funerals for different reasons, but there is often somebody standing by to take over if the person who's trying to tell the story finds it not easy to do so without weeping.
But do you think Italians are any different? Yeah, I know. Or do you think?
Yeah, I think in terms of showing emotions, certainly a little bit more open. But so what I found different here is like the culture of actually celebrating the life of the person, and meeting very often in a pub, and after the service, and going to the pub and having a drink together. So it's more like a celebration. Whereas for me, my experience, and Italy is a very varied country, so it depends really where you come from. But from the north, where I come from, it's a very somber, it's a very sad affair. It's like in the church, like really, you know, no celebration really is allowed. There's like this very heavily felt grief. So, you know, we wouldn't go to the pub or any kind of thing. But culture is changing now, so I believe that maybe things are a little bit different now. But funerals that I remember from my childhood, they were just very, very somber, very very sad. You go to the church and then that's it, basically. So what I found here that is quite positive, in my opinion, is this way of celebrating and getting together and maybe having a drink together.
I think that partly may be linked to what we were saying before, that whereas maybe historically funerals happen quite quickly, and so people probably mostly were coming from local areas, and probably had been more likely involved with that person who has died with their most recent life. Now a lot of people will come from distances, and they need to be refreshed before they leave, and they need also perhaps to try and share something of the reason that they've gathered at this point, which then turns the thing around, perhaps from a saying goodbye to a celebrating the life of.
Sure.
I don't know, we've got a funeral in a couple of weeks here for someone, and it's the first time that I remember it being arranged in a particular way, and it's to do very much with the person involved. But there is a mass at 11 o'clock in the morning, and it will be a full-on, although this is a Church of England church, it will be a full-on Eucharist funeral service like that. And then the actual funeral is at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And I was asking one of the priests involved, you know, how is that going to work for people? And he said, well, he thought actually it was going to be two fairly distinct groups of people, that the initial service is more likely to be involving local people who knew this person well within the church and community setting, and that the extended family and maybe professional and other friends are more likely to come to the afternoon one. And that sort of is kind of a strange dichotomy in a way of the person.
And I also think it's a different type of grief if you bury somebody after 3 days, 2-3 days. and after 3 weeks or 4 weeks, because in that time you process the death, you have time to think, you have time to reflect, and it's not the same type of grief. After 2-3 days it's still so fresh that, you know, it's almost like you just have the bare amount of time to do the most important things, to organize the fundamental things, let alone all the speech and all the rest of it. So it's a different type of grief, I think. 3 days compared to 3 weeks.
Very much so. I think that's right. Yeah.
The whole thing, sorry.
No, carry on, Chris.
I was just thinking about the celebrating of life. One of my friends is even older than me, and she had her 80th birthday a couple of years ago. Her husband is quite a lot younger than her, so she's very aware, although it's not something we talk about all the time, that her life is not going to be very likely as long as his, or at least they're not going to be together. Oh, I don't know. You know, she's going to die before him probably. So for her 80th birthday, she said, I want to celebrate my life now. I don't want to wait until, you know, you celebrate it when I'm gone. And so she asked us in celebration of her life to write a poem about her, or to write something. And it was really interesting because, I mean, of the group of my particular friends, close friends with her and their husbands, there are, I suppose, half a dozen of us with other halves. And I jumped up and wrote something because it appealed to me as a concept. And one other friend's husband wrote something, but nobody else could bring themselves to do it. And it was really interesting. I don't think it was that they felt unable to write a poem, which is obviously one big challenge, but the idea that we were sort of almost, we were celebrating what had gone, but almost preparing ourselves, I suppose, for the fact that she wouldn't be there forever, as will none of us.
That reminds me of a few years ago. I can't quite remember what prompted me to do this, but I wrote a note to sort of people who were important to me, saying what I appreciated about them. And my brother David sent me a message back by text. He said, "Hey, wait a minute." He said, "I'm not dead yet," because he said it sounded like an obituary. But anyway, there is something very funny about the person not being there for whom you're sort of recounting the stories. Yeah.
I suppose that illustrates the point that funeral is not entirely for the person who's gone, but for the people who are left behind.
Well, really only for the people left behind, in my view.
I was hesitating to say that. I suppose the person who is gone would at some level be comforted by the thought that somebody was having a funeral for them, was going to have a funeral for them, depending on your various faith and belief issues, stances.
I think for people left behind, it's incredibly helpful if the person who has just died had made it known how they would like anything to happen. Whether that's fulfilled or not is another matter. But you were saying, Liana, that, you know, in 3 days there's a lot to work out, what to do, how, and the official things that have to be done, and the specifics for that individual and things. And so I guess that for that situation, as much as one where you've got several weeks possibly, it is helpful to have some idea. But it's funny, isn't it? I mean, to be taking your point, Ian or Steve, do I mind what happens after? I don't have any right to mind whether what happens really after I've gone, you know, I'm bye-bye sort of thing. But I do think that funerals can be a time when you find out a lot more about the person you thought you knew well. You know, I can remember way back when I was a young mum, and one of my friends who'd been a colleague died quite suddenly after a short illness. And she'd been round to my home for lunch with my 2 small children just a couple of weeks before. And I found that quite shocking. But I went to her funeral and I thought I knew her well because she was both a friend and a colleague. But I listened to all the other things that people were saying and I realized I knew just a small part of that person, and she was so much more than I'd ever known. And so from that point of view, I think a funeral can be quite enhancing, but in a way it's a bit late, isn't it?
I like the idea of having this celebration before the actual funeral. That's a very good idea. Yeah. I think it's the Queen that had, or the royal family, or this type of people that have a rehearsal of their own funeral before it actually happens. Right? So you have an idea what's going to happen.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yes.
There was a funeral. I don't know if anybody knows Balquhidder Glen in Scotland, central Scotland, but it's quite famous for all sorts of reasons, and it is thought of. It's always thought of as being a very kind of spirit-connected place. It's called a thin place because the veil between our world and the next is said to be very thin here, and there have always been stories about it and anecdotes and whatever. But in the Glen, for that reason, a gentleman had chosen to settle here probably about 40 years ago, and he was a real character. And he lived in a bent wood tent, like the travellers used to live in. And as he got older, he would take refuge in friends' houses for the winter, but he just couldn't wait to get back to his bender in the springtime and live there in the fresh air and whatever. He was probably what would have been known in the past as a Shanachie, but he was a poet and created music in his own idiom, and was quite famous for his appearance and his flowing beard, long hair, never seen without a kilt, and just lived a very different life from everybody else. And he became very ill and was diagnosed with cancer, and was carted off to hospitals and things. And one of the surgeons said to him, "This is what we can do, and it'll give you a 50% chance of a normal lifespan." And he told him in 2 very short words what you could do with his operations. And it was just the most fascinating process because he had these spiritual, very, I think, deeply ingrained culturally, socially, historically, as well as personal to him. But he had these very acute spiritual sort of beliefs and experiences. He wasn't the least bit fussed. He just was looking forward to another adventure. And it's the first time I've seen that. People can be reconciled to their impending death, but he was just absolutely unfazed about it. And he then sat down and started sketching out his tombstone and planning his funeral and who he wanted there. And he had the most amazing musicians came along and played and sang at his funeral. It was a woodland funeral, and it was the most remarkable funeral. I would have loved to have been asked to do that one. It was just amazing. But it's just that sense of somebody who had no qualms about his destiny that made it so different from anything I've ever experienced. I've known some people who were very cold-blooded about their own demise, but never somebody who was actually almost excited about what was going to happen next.
As you're speaking, I'm thinking of a lady I heard on the radio a few weeks back who said she was a researcher into near-death experiences. And I think she was a psychotherapist in some. Anyway, she was the presenter asked her, he said, and what do you think about death? And she said, obviously, I'm really looking forward to it, which is a bit like that. Because the truth is, none of us, we've all got ideas, someone's got beliefs, we've got thoughts, we've got sort of readings and poems. Nobody really knows. And she said, I can't wait to find out. And then also, one of my gardening customers out here in France, who I feel employed me more as a conversationalist rather than a gardener, because I mostly enjoy talking to her. But she always talked about the next great adventure, which I mean, she was late 70s, I suppose, and not in great health. And she always said, you know, as if she didn't know, but there was something there to expect. Which I thought was the next great adventure is a good way to point it, portray it, really.
That's very much the Peter Pan thing, isn't it? Dying is an awfully big adventure, I think is the quote from that.
Oh, I didn't know that. Right, okay.
Yeah. But I think probably when Peter Pan said it, he was a bit sort of uncertain about the idea, whereas maybe this lady, and you know, is embracing it more. Because I think it's not so much, well, I mean, to be still looking forward and anticipating that big adventure is one half. The other side of that coin, I suppose, is what we're more familiar with because we've seen other people die, and that's the leaving behind, isn't it? And that's the thing that I think is hardest to think of, leaving behind those who we feel very close to or want to spend more time with or whatever.
But both Chris and I, both our parents died like more or less like switching out a light. It was big shock at the time. But now I realise we were spared the terrible business of this sort of slow decline into maybe Alzheimer's, maybe ill health, prolonged chronic ill health. And we were spared that. So looking back on it, although it was terrible sort of shock, definitely the way to go. But we can't really, almost never have any sort of control or say in the way that happens.
As you've said that comment, I personally feel that it's disgraceful that we don't have any agency. You have a right to life, you have a right to all sorts of things, but you don't have a right to and say your own life, though it be your settled will. And I think it's political cowardice amongst the legislature. But if you feel your life is unbearable, why do you not have the right under controlled conditions to end it? Other countries allow it, other states in America allow it. Yeah, we've all been in that situation. A friend, actually the friend that died, whose funeral was a year ago yesterday, his mother had died after a long illness, and he said you would not be allowed, you would be prosecuted for keeping your pet alive if it was in the condition that his mother was. And you know, he was distraught about, not about the fact of her dying, but about the fact that she had to be kept alive, you know, by the health service when it was no longer helpful to her.
Sure, this is what you were saying, Chris, that we have all this medical advancement and medication that keep people alive, and but for what reason? When we are in a vegetative state or almost a vegetative state, or suffering a lot and having lots of pain, and despite that continuing, you know, keeping people alive, that's in itself, I think, it's wrong. Yeah, but the thing is, we don't really know how we react when we are in this situation, if we are still able, if we have still the mental capability, because for example, my father was a person that used to say, I would never go to that state. I just want to die if I'm very ill or I'm suffering, or I become not self-sufficient. But actually, when he got ill, he had cancer. He clung very much to his life until the last day. So we don't really know how we react. We may say something now because we are not in the situation, but when we are in the situation, for whatever reason, maybe life becomes really, really precious, even in that condition. So it's very difficult, because we may put something in writing. I don't want to get there, but when we are there, maybe we don't want to die.
Yeah.
And another thing that can come into play is that sometimes families will very much want their relative to be kept alive, even when common sense, whatever that means, and compassion maybe would suggest that that's not the most constructive thing. And then it can be very difficult for professional medical and nursing people if a family is really adamant that everything should be done for someone. It can be difficult too, that other way around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
A subject of some discussion in my family, because my mother, and she died at the age of 94, but she'd been failing for some years. And she, well, I asked my brother one day after she'd died, and I said, "Are you okay about it?" And he went, "Well, it's hardly a surprise, is it? She's told us for the last 50 years that she was just about to die." So, but she never wanted to. She would have hated the idea of being in a nursing home. She said from the day she moved into her last house that she was going out feet first, and feet first in a coffin, and that was her intent. She would have hated the way her life ended. But my brother went in. He made a large detour to go and see her, and when he found her, she was delirious and very, very close to death. Well, of course, she got carted into hospital, as you would do under any circumstances, and she spent 13 months in hospital bed blocking, with no diagnosis, no cure, and then she spent another year and a bit in a nursing home, but she never recovered the faculties she'd had before that, and she would just have hated it. And we're all clearly of the opinion that actually it would have been kinder and more in keeping with her wishes if my brother hadn't gone in that day and found her, because she'd have been found the next day dead. If that doesn't sound too harsh, but it would have been actually what she wanted and what she stated she wanted all of her life, just to be allowed to die in her own home, and not drag on. Yes, so discuss.
Well, it's hard, isn't it, when it's your own mother, and the person who's given you life and everything, to sort of take that stand back, especially in the acute moment. But I do think it represents what maybe where we started a bit, that we just don't really, we're not prepared to accept the whole pattern of life, which is including death. If you look at nature anywhere, there is a normal arc, isn't there, from birth through to death. But and in the animal kingdom, what happened to your mother wouldn't have happened, obviously, and that's it. I think it's partly to do with our individual and societal inability to actually just accept that this is the arc and where we are on it, sort of thing.
But what's interesting is, just to pick up on Ian's point about an agency for the right to die or whatever, you talk to individuals, and most individuals that I know would agree with what you've just said. It is an arc, and we know it's an arc, but somehow corporately we can't, or collectively we can't do that. We can't enshrine that. And so, yeah.
Enshrine, a good word.
Oh yeah.
But it is regardless of your beliefs, it is a sacred right, RIGHT, a sacred duty, a sacred responsibility to preserve life and to cherish life. So it's interesting that, you know, enshrine is probably exactly the word.
It's difficult. I mean, thinking about, you know, your brother in that situation, because it was probably aware, I don't know, but probably aware of your mom's wishes. But in that moment, there is this kind of instinct, yeah, the instinct that kicks in, and it's like life is precious, and you want to save the life of a loved one, or even your own. Sometimes, you know, if even if you know that there is no future. So it's an instinct, and it's difficult to just let go of that, even if in the long term probably it's not the best decision, not the decision that the deceased would have liked to taken in that moment. Yeah,
No,
but
there's
it's
no doubt. She has 4 children, and there's no doubt that that's not, you know, there's the 4 of us know that that is not the decision she would have wanted.
But that there is, yeah, it's difficult for the people that take care of you know, like people that have an illness. It's really difficult to decide, okay, that's the end of it. I just I respect the wishes of my relative, and I take a step back. I think there is a sense of guilt, maybe, underneath, that if you know, it's my fault if this person died. It's lots of emotions that are at play in that moment, and it's very difficult to manage them.
I think if her children hadn't been so experienced and trained in matters to do with authorities and health and things, that we wouldn't have been able to get the doctor to come out, but we knew which words to say to get the doctor out. And then that sparked off a chain of events. If it had been a doctor that knew her well, if it had been a regular practitioner for the years before, he might have said, let's put her in bed and make her comfortable. Because it was an unfamiliar doctor, she goes through all the...
Sure. Yeah. The procedure, because there is a legal aspect. You know, there can be potentially investigated if you didn't do all the things that. And there is a lot of this in medical professional nowadays in the NHS. It's like, make sure that I did everything to cover myself. So anything that happens, I know that I did everything possible. And sometimes it's not in the best interest of the person at all.
No. When it came time for, when it became, well, she just suddenly stopped eating, and the doctor was called in because that was very unusual, and she detected a large sort of tumor in her gastrointestinal tract, and well, we both said to her, she appears to be in pain. And she said, well, I can't increase her medication. And we said, well, she's in pain. She needs to be given, she needs to be made comfortable. And so the doctor resisted quite a long time, but I think she was just being diligent and making sure that we understood, you know, we actually understood the implications of giving her more medication. But she was very tough, and she lasted a week before she finally expired. But that doctor, again, to us, did absolutely the right thing. You know, there's no point. She was unconscious. There's no point in. She was unconscious to us, but she definitely appeared to be in pain, and there was absolutely no hope. She was just going to waste away. But in contrast, so I think that doctor absolutely did the right thing, and I think my brother particularly did the right thing in insisting that she be made comfortable.
Mhm.
But I recount with I don't know, just a situation that was completely different. I was saying that my great-grandparents all died in my grandparents' house.
Mhm.
And the doctor was called out to one of them, and he came downstairs and he said, "That's the death struggle begin." The words that my grandmother used, "That's the death struggle begun. It'll not be long now." And my granny said to the doctor, "Oh, is there nothing you can do for him?" And the doctor said, "Oh, okay." And he went upstairs and he came back down and he said, "That's him gone now." And that was right in those days.
Mhm.
Wow.
But it's
How,
not something that doctors are quite as willing to do.
Mhm.
how did you hear that? Yeah, who told you that?
That was my grandmother.
She told you that.
Uh-huh.
Wow,
Uh-huh.
that is an incredible story.
But it's what happened in those days, and it still happens. You know, that's exactly what the doctor did with my mother. She increased the medication to control the pain, but that was going to shorten her life.
Yeah.
I mean, the doctor actually said she won't see the day out. As it happens, you know, that's how frail, physically frail she was. So that was basically the same thing, but it was just the fact that I mean, my grandmother was telling me how shocked she was, and it's not what she'd meant at all, but it was a normal situation to ease people's suffering in that situation. And you have to trust your doctor and just hope you don't get the wrong one, if you know what I mean.
Compassionate approach rather than yeah, exactly. A doctor that doesn't know you at all, doesn't know your family, is just on duty that night, and of course it won't take this responsibility to.
No, they
It just
can't
goes
do it.
by the book. They can't do it.
Uh-huh.
It really depends on the relationship, how you feel. This human component that goes well above and beyond the books and the procedures and the law is our ability to think in that moment what is in the best interest. Common sense, I don't know how to call it, compassion, but yeah. And you know, professionals are too scared nowadays to take any personal decision.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Ian.
And rightly so, actually.
Right, so I'm minded to draw this to a conclusion. We've been going for a good hour. It seems like about 5 minutes. But while we've been talking, somebody who would have liked to join but couldn't has sent me a poem, which might or might not be relevant, but I'll read it out since it's her participation in this spree. And unless anyone's got something they desperately want to say before we finish this time, I'll read the poem, and then I'm going to turn the recording off, and then I want to just ask you something after that, which anybody watching the recording will wonder what on earth it is, but you'll never know. So this is from Helena, and it's titled When I Go. When I go, don't learn to live without me. Just learn to live without me in a different way. And if you need to see me, just close your eyes or look in your shadow when the sun shines. I'm there. Sit with me in the quiet, and you will know that I did not leave. There is no leaving when one soul is blended with another. When I'm gone, don't learn to live without me. Just learn to look for me in the memories. And, so that's from Helena.
Beautiful. Very nice.
So let me just turn the record.